Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of the NetOps Expert. As always, I am so happy to be joined by Alec Pinkham, my partner in crime here for the network observability solution at Broadcom. Alex, say hi.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
Today, we're going to talk about maturity. Now, I have none. Alec probably has a lot more than me, but really network observability maturity and what it means. We've been talking network observability for a while now. Some people still think it's hype. Some people don't. Some people think there's value in it. Some people don't. We're going to talk about a network observability maturity model that Alec and I and the team have developed based on data from 500 plus IT professionals out there. And we'd like to start talking about a way to find a roadmap to achieving network observability. That means achieving monitoring excellence, maximizing the return on your modern networking and cloud investments. Really, it's about doing the most you can do with all the data that you're collecting. But are you collecting all that data? What are you doing with that data? Is it in multiple databases? Are they correlated? Are they giving you a 10,000-foot view of global network health across all your multi-vendor tech? Do you have any visibility in ISP and cloud networks? Because that's where most of your network delivery experiences are now. I'm sure you don't. You're not a network god of Verizon, or unless you're listening and you work at Verizon, or Comcast or CenturyLink. You're not a god at CenturyLink, but you still have to deal with the customer experience that your customers, your users are experiencing when using those public networks. And we're going to talk about how we can grow your network observability practice to be able to expand that visibility, get all the data you need, even from these unmanaged networks, to make quick and intelligent decisions. Maybe one of those decisions is, I have the data to prove it's not me, it's the ISP. And at the end of the day, that's what all NetOps teams want, right? Kill the blame game, have data to prove it's not you, it's me, and then get their users up and running as quickly as possible. Skip the war room. Yep. All right, Alec, why don't you kick it off? What are we going to first talk about?
So we pretty much always start with something around what are the challenges we're facing that is causing us to think about this. And I think with maturity in network operations specifically, it's a good one to think about because we're often trying to update our networks or upgrade our networks. But when we think about maturity, we're thinking about actually changing how we're monitoring, managing, or looking at our networks. So we're used to, adding more devices, adding more technologies and things like that. But we're not always used to saying, like, is our network observable in a way that helps us do things faster? Right? Does it help us resolve issues faster? Does it help us get into a position where maybe in the future, something like AI can help us figure out what problems are faster or kind of get us into that proactive or predictive stances?
And you know what? Let me make a comment really quick because you said something that we've been saying forever, and I think we need to change how we're saying it. You said, how much visibility we have into our networks. Maybe we need to rephrase that and saying, how much visibility do you have in the networks your customers are using? Because most of the time, they're not going to be using your networks.
Well, it's not just customers, right? It's end users. And so you're right. We often internally and to customers talk about the network delivery path, because that's a little bit more, it kind of begs the question of where's the path to and from? What's the source and what's the target from the monitoring standpoint, but also means, okay, where are your users sitting? Are they internal users that are, hybrid work, or are they internal users in your offices, or are these end customers that could be globally scattered and we need to figure out how their connections are when they're connecting into our databases, our data servers, and ultimately our data centers, whether they be private cloud or public.
Yeah. So let's talk about what we found from the data that we collected with a third-party vendor. And we asked 504 IT professionals out there, from network managers, CIOs, network admins, architects, everyone on the network team. What did we find out about the key challenges in them trying to gain visibility into the networks their users, their customers are using when it's not just theirs?
Yeah. And the first thing that we always think about is complexity, right? Like that's something that is always coming up, and it comes up in a few key different ways, right? I mentioned one of them already, hybrid work, right? Where we have almost all, based on our recent studies, 95% or so that are supporting hybrid environments to some extent, right? And it might not be as big as it was during the pandemic or afterwards, but We have a lot of return to office type of movements for larger corporations. And whether or not that's wholesale back to the office or just partial, like you're still supporting a hybrid network. And now you're being tasked with, okay, no one's been in that office for, a few years, or we're drastically increasing the number of people that are going to be in the office. Were there any networking decisions that were made or any technological updates that are going to impact the performance and the bandwidth once we get a lot of people back in the office? And I think that's something that we're starting to see is as we're going back, there are parts of the office and the office network that have kept up with the demand, but there are others where, hey, were we not paying for an upgraded connection because we only had 100 people in the office and now we're getting back to 1,000, right? It's a big difference. And so, when we talk about hybrid work, I feel like everyone thinks about, like the home workers and things like that. No, it's the volume that's coming back to the office that is also going to be a problem.
You bring up a good point because Schlumberger, an oil service and gas company, when the pandemic hit, we helped them gain insight into the expanded ability to support all their at-home users now. They went from 10,000 VPN users to 60,000 in a day. So we help them understand the bandwidth they're going to need, the concurrent licenses they're going to need, the resources they're going to need to support this. But now this could be a cost savings opportunity for them if their users are coming back into the office. We don't need to be paying this much for all these licenses. We don't need the extra bandwidth at the edge. It's complexity. Now, granted, it's not, building up, it's breaking down a little bit, but still without the visibility into that, you wouldn't even know what to break down and how much money you're saving.
Right. So another angle on that is if you think about what apps we're using today versus when, you left the office, if it was multiple years ago, or just in general, the number of apps that we're using today that didn't exist a few years ago, the adoption of these applications is going to have different network constraints and things that IT has to kind of take advantage of, in the sense of they need to go find out what apps these are and understand what load they're putting on the network, especially as people return to the office. And I think we're also seeing, kind of as a final piece for the complexity piece, is the number of changes we've seen as far as reliance on third parties, right? We have technologies like SD-WAN and other components that add layers of obfuscation on top of that underlying network, but also are fundamentally large portions of our networks that users are sending traffic over minute by minute, and we need to be able to see that or understand what the overlay versus underlay looks like. So there are a lot of different components there as far as complexity is concerned.
And what about complexity, a non-tech complexity? I mean, you and I are hearing a lot, and it's in this this white paper that we're going to tease around staff shortages, which means expertise shortages, which means if I don't have an SD-WAN architect on my team because he got let go, but he just deployed the SD-WAN architecture, the L1, L2 NOC guys are going to have to figure out how to help triage this very complex issue. So how, we're going to talk about how that a maturity model can help enable and empower these L1 operators to get the information they need surfaced to them in an easy way so even they can troubleshoot what could be a very complex overlay or underlay performance issue.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing some interesting things come up around that, because a lot of vendors and a lot of the space is focusing on how do I up-level that L1 person, whether or not I've lost people or I have a lot of institutional knowledge in a few core groups, but I don't have it for any of my new hires, right? It's how do you capture that? How do you make use of that? And we've seen a couple different approaches, right? There's obviously the fun trend that everyone wants to get on of AI and using natural language processing to have L1 people say, hey, where should I focus? What's the biggest problem? And have the system respond to that, which is interesting, but it doesn't really teach you much about the network. So I think a lot more focuses on how do I make sense of large data sets and then simplify by things like alarm noise suppression or context of topology of saying, hey, I'm going to get rid of any downstream events because I know the upstream event is actually the root cause. Like that root cause analysis piece is coming in a fair amount. And there's just a lot of interesting updates that I think are focused around that core problem of either losing the losing the number of, I guess, level 3 people you have, or just not as many people coming into the system, or maybe even budgetary constraints where you don't have as many people being hired to backfill.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've talked about this before. The folks that are graduating, looking to get an IT tech job, all they hear about is cloud. They hear about AI. The network has always been and was supposed to be invisible. So a lot of folks out there, unless it goes down, and then it's obviously the one to blame. But a lot of the graduates out there aren't going into networks because the network just works. I'm going to airdrop something to you. I'm going to text you. I'm going to use this app on my phone and order dinner. And, it's just invisible. And unfortunately, the power of visibility of its invisibility is not working to gain folks and get them into network operations as a career.
Well, and I think that's interesting because you have a lot of people that are used to relying on a network as an individual. Right. And I think when a lot of like the current expertise in the industry are people who had to build networks from scratch and think about the whole, and either it was, hey, I've got, multiple machines at home and I need to network them. And I want to use this as my own personal kind of lab playground, which is what a lot of us have done. And then you've also got a lot of people who kind of came up in the industry and was like, hey, I got to bootstrap something and connect these up because we don't have enough power in these different components that we have in the closet. So I think it's funny because, you get a lot of people nowadays that are used to having an abundance of connectivity, abundance of storage, an abundance of anything. And so you don't have that kind of like, oh, well, I need to go optimize this in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And, you're seeing that with AI today is, you have almost all of a sudden we've got these constraints of, okay, do I have enough power? Do I have enough, a GPU for some of these tasks? And it's changing quickly, but we're also, we're seeing things even most recently with the latest AI news is that like there might be ways to train models that are quicker and cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of a sudden we might be back to this abundance model of you're not spending time tweaking and optimizing, you're spending time chasing the next coolest thing or the next biggest thing.
So obviously we're segueing, is that right? Segueing. That's funny. I should leave this in here. We're segueing into some of the significant implications to network operations teams from all this network complexity. The network complexity was hybrid work and cloud adoption and unmanaged network access to ISP and cloud network performance. But what does that mean to the L1, L2 NOC operators in their day-to-day jobs? Like what is going to give them the headaches that they deal with every day? You and I both know, as the report shows, 84% of network operations teams regularly learn about network issues from users instead of their monitoring tools, which is sad because, God, networking has been around for 30, 40 plus years, and users are still the ones finding the issues a lot of times. What do you think about that, Alec?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a component of that. We are definitely proponents of testing, not only from the end user perspective here at Broadcom, but also testing to those business critical apps that your users are kind of leveraging for productivity. So if you're not testing those, then yeah, you're going to get complaints, and there's always going to be the turn it off and turn it on again complaints of people who are not as savvy with computers and maybe haven't restarted their Mac in a year. But that's the kind of stuff that you're going to get some of that. The fact that the number is so high is a little bit striking because if any of those are getting critical issues reported by users, that's what we want to avoid. We want to get rid of those critical issues, critical outages, things like that, because from a, break fix standpoint, right, we can fix a lot of things. We want to limit the one-to-one fixes where we have to spend our time dealing with, whoever it is in whatever department who is having a problem because they clicked the wrong link on the wrong email. Right. But we're still we're gonna focus on the ones that are kind of bigger issues, right? If there is an outage for an application or for a service or even a network, you're likely going to get an email from your corporate or your group that says, hey, we've noticed this, we're on it. Right. And that's the part that builds that like confidence and kind of builds the reputation of the network team and the IT team. And I think that's what causes people to come come with real problems and not like waste your time
Right.
as much as if you have that, oh, they're probably on it already. That can be good and bad, right? That's a double-edged sword. If someone says, oh, they're probably on it, I'm not going to report it, then maybe you miss something big, right? So you want to avoid that. But I think the more we can get to, either that end user perspective or covering all the apps or covering all the networks, really that end-to-end piece, and back to like that network delivery path discussion we had, is if you can cover all of that and have alerting, alarming, and all of that, then you've got a point where, back to our original point, you get to a level of maturity that kind of guarantees that you've got the confidence of the company, right? And if you fall behind that, like there's this imaginary line where if you fall behind that, people start doubting, your value, or it kind of looks at you as a cost center.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we want to try to avoid, just by getting people to think about where they are from a maturity standpoint, just so they can figure out, okay, if we're investing in new technologies, are those helping us get to that next level of maturity, or are those going to provide another challenge that we're going to have to overcome in order to kind of even keep the level of maturity that we have in the network?
So as Alec and I continue to talk about what we believe at Broadcom is a mature network observability practice, you will see, well, in this YouTube version of this podcast, the stages that we believe you move through as you advance your network monitoring practices, as you deploy new software-defined technologies, as you expand your visibility into unmanaged networks like ISP and cloud. And then finally, when you start to automate. And listen, network automation has been talked about for years. It hasn't caught on because it's scary. But the nirvana is starting with just automating simple tasks like enriching a ticket with more details, escalating a ticket, closing a ticket, maybe rolling back a configuration that was, excuse the expression, fat-fingered. I've done it 1,000 times and have unfortunately had pretty many network outages because of it. These are those small tasks that can relieve you and give you more time back to concentrate on the more challenging triage issues you may be dealing with. So, we talked about reactive mode, users telling NetOps teams that there's something wrong. But one of the biggest issues that many of our customers have today, and we are told by them, is that their technologies just produce too much noise. So listen, network transformation is about adopting the latest and greatest technology to improve business processes and improve procedures and break down silos, but they don't tell you that they come with a lot of noise when things aren't working. So said this 1,000 times, Cisco ACI can produce upward of 23,000 events and alarms. And these, when not correlated and suppressed and applied with advanced network observability practices on top of it, this is what leads to long triage times. This is what leads to looking for that needle in a haystack. You can't even begin to use automation to escalate a ticket until you begin to find the breadcrumbs that will lead you to the root cause. And with 23,000 events and alarms, it could be a while before you find those breadcrumbs. Tell me what you think, Alec.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add there is that even with that kind of top level maturity where we want like automated remediation and some level of automation for changes, we understand that there's still likely going to be a human pressing the button, even if it's, all wrapped up with the bow and you get like a full incident report of what happened, what should be changed and all this. We know there's still going to be someone that probably wants to press the button so that we're not doing this fully automated. And maybe there are certain components that we're fine having automated changes, right? We already see that with little things like SD-WAN, right? SD-WAN is making decisions on your path, on the overlay. But when it comes to fixing issues, there's likely still going to be a human part of that. While I think everyone would love to be kind of at that top level, we're likely not there yet. Could we get there soon? Yeah, but it's going to take some time, right? This is a goal, not not an assessment in the sense of like, hey, you got to get an A and you got to be all the way to the right. You got to be at the top of the pyramid, whatever.
So listen, we've covered in this first podcast on network observability maturity, just what is network complexity, what's causing folks to have the headaches in network teams today, and then diving a little deeper into what some of those headaches look like from network complexity, like too many alarms, no visibility into ISP and cloud, users telling you about outages before you know it, SD-WAN overlay and underlay correlation, which can completely transform your triage times over SD-WAN application delivery. And for those folks watching this on YouTube, I'm going to put up a graphic that talks about the stages that we're going to cover in some ongoing podcasts on this topic. For folks listening in, just imagine like stage one is a manual stage in where most of us have been, where none of our IT tools are talking to each other. They have their own databases. There's no analytics involved. It's red and freak the hell out and war room times and blaming others. And nobody wants that anymore. I am sure most of the listeners out there have moved beyond that, which is fabulous, into a more traditional environment where you now have network observability across your physical devices, everything that you own inside the four walls of data center, across those dedicated WAN links to your branch offices. You know what's going on, every packet, every route, but according to your physical infrastructure. But then as you become more advanced and you deploy more software-defined solutions, you become more proactive because you're expanding your observability across now physical and virtual network devices, understanding how the correlation of the performance of those virtual devices is to the physical devices. So for example, software-defined WAN, what's the controller saying about performance? And then what do we know about the performance of the physical infrastructure hosting that SD-WAN technology, white boxes, whatever you want to call them. So now you have full coverage across everything you own, physical and virtual, inside the four walls of your data center, across dedicated WANs into the branch office. But now, like we talked about, you're supporting user experiences across ISP and cloud and home networks only, possibly for folks who haven't come into the office yet, that don't even step into the four walls of your data center for network delivery. So you got to gain that visibility into those unmanaged networks so you know who to blame. And if it's you, you'll know right away. And if it's not, you'll know right away. And then finally, taking all this great visibility across traditional and virtual networks on any network out there, you own or not own. So you are seeing every packet, every piece of latency across physical, virtual devices in your data center, as well as ISP networks, cloud. Take all that great information, you start all that great data, and it's all about the data. I'll take that great data and start automating the troubleshooting and triage things that keep you from getting into more strategic initiatives for your team.
Yeah, well said. I think that's kind of what we're trying to do here.
So that graphic will be up here as you guys will see an idea of how we're heading for these podcasts. Again, it is not a sprint. It's a marathon. I would not sprint. I've only done half marathons, and I sure as hell wouldn't be sprinting, because after the first mile, I could have torn my meniscus, which I have done before. Slow and steady wins the race, and we're going to talk about how to stay slow and steady and win this race of improving network operations and network observability for not only your business, but your customers and their customers. So, Alec, I want to thank you so much, as always, as being my partner in crime. We always have a great discussion on tech. But as always, I thank you so much for the input you provide in these podcasts. And please stay tuned as we continue talking about network observability maturity. And we hope that this information also helps you develop your own network observability practices and grow slow and steady to find success. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the NetOps Expert, and we will see you soon.